My main purpose for being in Arkansas is indeed to talk about global climate change issues and how they affect all of us and how we all need to work together to do something about the problem that global climate change has caused, is causing, and will cause in the future if we don't stop some of the practices that we've had in the past. The League of Women Voters, U.S., has been working for the last couple of years with Oxfam America on a project called Sisters on the Planet. And I'm proud to say I'm a sister. I'm a sister on the planet with the concept that women and children are a group that is one of the most affected by some of the cataclysmic weather events that have been caused by global climate change. So the Sisters on the Planet project that Oxfam initiated is really to bring forth this concept that women and children are being and have been adversely affected, and we need to all help them learn adaptation kinds of ways to adapt to their changed environment. So, my talk today will really talk about the League of Women Voters over our 90 years and why it is that we're involved with environmental issues. The League of Women Voters was an outgrowth of women's suffrage, but in an unusual kind of a way. This new cadre of voters needed to be trained in this political realm of how to vote, procedurally how to vote. They also needed to be trained in the issues and candidates that were going to be on the ballot. So the League of Women Voters got started to essentially bring this new cadre of voters into political life. Well, it didn't take too long for the League of Women Voters to recognize that this concept wasn't just a women's issue. This concept was an all-citizen, an all-voter issue. And so over our 90 years of history, we have looked at various public policy issues. We are formed because we study and take positions on policies that our government at either the local, the state, or the national level can do something about. And over the 90 years of our history, the issue of those public policies, the list of those public policies, seems like it's growing and growing and growing. And a lot of people say, well, isn't the League of Women Voters just about voting and getting information to voters? And we say, well, we do that, but we're also very interested in having an informed and active citizenry. And so that part of the equation very often is some of the larger work that we're known for. We are organized at the local, the state, and the federal level, and most of you have reached out and touched someone at our local league level rather than interacting with the National League. But that's us. We're grassroots. And we come to the environmental issues that are just being talked about on the video with a long history. I want to tell you a little bit about that. We got started in 1920. Well, in 1921, we were faced with a little issue that was kind of a leftover issue after World War I. The Muscle Shoals facility, which ultimately became the Tennessee Valley Authority project, bringing hydroelectric power to the Tennessee Valley. We got involved from 1921 until 1933, when the TVA was finally adopted by Congress and signed by the President. And when I say we got involved, I don't mean we were just sitting back watching the issue. That's not the League. That's not how we do things in the League. The first thing that we do is we study the issue. We identify a particular issue that we think the government could do a better job at or could get involved in that they're not already involved in. We identify that issue, and then we embark upon a study, whether it's a local issue that our local leagues are studying or a national issue that we're studying nationwide. We, as in all of the voter information that we provide to you, we like to have a balanced approach. We like to see all sides of an issue. And that's why we very often look at things from a public policy standpoint rather than a knee-jerk reaction of one position or another. And what we have brought over the years to the environmental issue is exactly that. We have a lot of coalition partners that we work with that work primarily on pro-environmental protection kinds of issues. And they very often don't have the tools that the League has, do not understand the public policy making process the way that the League does, and how to interact at various segues along the way in the actual building of public policy. We were having a delightful discussion over lunch about how you get citizens to really recognize that we live in a representative democracy, and in fact, it's extremely important to us to know the issues before we go to the polling booth, but to also keep our elected officials on their toes by talking to them afterwards, keeping informed about the particular issues, and interacting with our elected officials, because we are a representative democracy, and that means we act through our elected officials. And we who have a little bit of gray hair in the audience here, we know that. But we're a little bit distressed that some of the school children coming up are not being trained in public advocacy and how to participate. And so I encourage all of you to be their role models for them. Be active. Make sure that you know what your city council or county commission is doing. Be active. Go down and take a child or grandchild down and see what city council has to do. That's how we in the League go about doing our work, and that's how, over the years, since that first environmental issue of the Muscle Shoals TVA project, that really came about because of the interest of the League of Women Voters in protecting our natural resources, but also from a social policy standpoint of being able to bring affordable electric power to a part of the country that was not the most affluent area, and to harness our natural resources for the benefit of society. So we look at the use of our natural resources from that kind of a perspective, not necessarily just let's save the silvery minnow kind of an approach that some of our partner organizations do. We look at all sides of the issue. What impact is climate change having on people like the women that we saw in this video, from the extreme climate event changes to what impact does it have if we move to renewable energy sources in this country? What impact does it have on jobs? What is the potential for creating new jobs in your communities built around renewable energy? You might kind of say that we like to have it all. We like to have that win-win kind of compromise situation that brings everybody to the table, recognizing that everybody comes with a different perspective, a different goal in mind, and recognizing that everyone has a valid point of view. And that's how the League over the years has come to be known, such a trusted independent validator of the truth about issues and the facts about issues. We have worked on environmental issues. In the 1950s, we turned our attention primarily to water resources. We recognized that even within our own league, we had leagues in the northeast part of the country that were interested in flood control from a water resource standpoint. We had leagues in the southwest part of the country that were interested because they didn't have enough water. They were interested just in getting water. In other parts of the country, there were different kinds of water resource issues. And in the 1950s, we tried to bring this all together with a national study of what the role of government should be in terms of bringing their influence and regulation to bear on water resources to make sure that water resources were being used for the good of the public interest. And so, as a result of that, we did a study and we worked on legislation, which ultimately, we've worked on legislation, everything from the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Water Act. We took part in 1955 when there were disastrous floods and severe droughts, and we plunged into those subjects of conservation. And we ended up thinking, well, water is just a small microcosm of this environmental world that we live in. And so it was by opening our eyes and studying the role of government in protecting water resources that we then branched out to looking at all of the other environmental issues that later became quite popular in the 1970s. Everything from where do you throw your trash? How should solid waste management be controlled? What role does the government have to play in the management of solid waste? What about this air emission problem? The Clean Air Act was one of our major efforts in the 1970s to get that passed, to make sure that there were some restrictions on auto emissions as well as on plants that were polluting our environment. And so we worked very hard on that. We actually held hearings around the country on that issue, as we later did on the issue of nuclear waste disposal in the 1990s. The League's interest has evolved over the years as issues have come to our attention that could be affected in some way by the government. And so that's what brings us to today and working so actively on global climate change. We operate in a recognition of the political environment in which we live. We know that there are naysayers out there. We know that there are people who are trying to influence citizens to believe that there are no effects of climate change, that people are having no contributing factor in climate change. We recognize that, but the League of Women Voters has looked at the science, and we feel quite comfortable that people are having a serious effect on our environment over years. We need to understand the difference between climate change and plain old weather. And the unfortunate public policy dispute, shall we say, that arose about a month ago with respect to the fact that the Northeast and Washington, D.C. was experiencing this huge snowfall. Well, don't let people snow you. You have to look and you have to understand the difference between climate change and weather. They are not the same. And in recent years, I have to tell you that the League of Women Voters has been battling this concept that if you have a 30-second soundbite on TV or radio, it must be true. And our goal is to educate citizens so that they can break down fact from fiction. They're not necessarily going to agree with the League of Women Voters' position. We're all different in what we bring to public policy issues. But if all of us can work together to try to get citizens to think on their own about these issues, isn't that novel? I think that we'll actually have some better public policy. Don't give up. Don't think, well, my voice doesn't count. Your voice does count. Your voice makes a huge difference when you tell your elected officials, hey, I want this partisan bickering to stop. I want a health care bill, or I don't want a health care bill, whichever side of the fence that you might be on. But when you say that, know what it is you're talking about. Know what the basic principles of that health care bill are before you say yes or no to it. Don't just listen to the overview. You've got to dig deep. You've got to dig very deep. And I have to tell you, we are going to see the very same thing on climate change legislation that we have seen this past year on health care legislation. Very same thing. Lies will be told, half-truths will be told, and we in the League of Women Voters and all of you have to be there to know the fact from the fiction. Because that's the only way that we as citizens are going to get the kind of society that we want. That's what the League of Women Voters has been doing for the last 90 years, chipping away at what it is that's in the public interest. Not my personal interest, not your individual interest, but in the collective public interest. And we all need to broaden our thinking about that, get outside of our skins, if you will, in order to see what's best for the collective good. And how do we translate that into public policy? By being there, by being at those public meetings, not allowing your voice to be drowned out by a whole bunch of naysayers, by educating yourself, by educating your neighbors, by working with organizations like the League of Women Voters, because we find that working collectively at the local, the state, and the national level is one of the best ways to change policy and to make policy that there is, because the same issues run at all different levels. For example, on the climate change issue, at the local level, you can do a lot to spread the word about preserving and not using so much electrical power, for example. Conservation measures, making sure that your local community brings conservation measures into play. Not letting people water their lawns all the time if you're in a drought area. Not letting people throw their trash to the side of the road. Local issues translate on up to the next levels. And your state legislature is instrumental also in this climate change issue, because as they look at renewable energy sources, they can make a big difference. They can give incentives, if you will, to production of jobs for renewable energy. They can find ways to effectively locate power plants that operate in a green fashion. And of course, then we get to the National Congress. That is the place where I've held forth here a little bit too much, I guess, in terms of the fact that our Congress at the moment is broken by partisan bickering. We citizens have not only the opportunity, but the obligation to get that under control. Remember, your elected officials represent you. You want them to get things done. I happen to, on behalf of the League of Women Voters, want Congress to pass a cap and trade piece of legislation. It may not be the best piece of legislation that there is, but we need the cap part of that. We need some incentive for industry to cap their emissions. And that's why the trade part of it comes into play. And it's that trade part that is the controversy. You're going to be seeing over the next 3 weeks probably at least 2 different bills being introduced. They're both bipartisan bills. I want each and every one of you to not only read the newspaper story when those bills drop. I want you to go on the internet and actually look at those bills. Look at what is being said about those bills, and then look at the actual bill and see if what is being said is really true. You'll find that you'll open your eyes rather wide when you hear a pundit on TV talking about a particular provision in that cap and trade bill, and you go to that provision in the bill and you say, well, I don't see that in here. Hold your representatives accountable. By knowing your stuff, you can affect public policy. Now, with that, that's what the League of Women Voters is all about. We are a nonpartisan membership organization with almost 900 local and state leagues across the country. We are in a lot of cities here in Arkansas. Our state league is very active here in Arkansas, and I challenge all of you to get involved with the league if you're not already involved, because not only do we get involved with environmental issues, but we get involved in just about every issue that your local, state, or national government can operate in. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Let's wait till we get the microphones, please.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Wilson. It was a really great speech. And what are the biggest barriers now to passing the cap and trade bill?
60 votes in the Senate. Does that sound like a broken record, I'm afraid? Yeah. That's why I'm so encouraged by these 2 bills that are supposed to be coming out in the next 3 weeks, because they are being introduced. One of them is being introduced jointly by John Kerry, Joe Lieberman, and Lindsey Graham. So we truly have a tripartisan bill there. And so I'm very hopeful that that one and the other one that Olympia Snow is apparently going to introduce, hopefully will bring some things on which we can really reach a compromise on and get that 60 vote.
Energy Committee that, unless he's gone, I don't know how anything can change. But I'd like to know what's different in those bills, if you know, that could bring some compromise.
The fact of the matter is that the bill that Lindsey Graham and Kerry and Lieberman are looking at is kind of heavy on the nuclear side, as we've just in the last week heard the president come on. And that's something that from the League's perspective we're going to have to take a hard look at because we want to make sure that their safety provisions are adequate in that bill, that we don't have any relaxation of standards, safety standards. The other part of the bill, as the one that was actually passed by the House last year, does do a lot to appease some of the issues that farmers have in terms of their emissions not being capped in the same way as major industry. I'm not sure, and they're not saying what that bill will really say with respect to coal-fired power plants, and that's really a major part of this puzzle.
We have Patrick back.
Hey, Ms. Wilson, I'm Patrick Banks, a student here at the Clinton School, and I wanted to say thank you for coming here today and sort of putting the fire underneath me to be more civically engaged, I guess.
Thank you.
You make a very relevant point when you say that, or when you point out that we are a representative democracy and not a participatory democracy, and that we all need to sort of stay involved with our representatives, but also be educated on the issues. And I guess I was just wondering if you could talk a little more about the League's efforts to get communities educated on the issues. It's a little more, I think it's a little more than just watching the news, maybe reading the newspapers. What are some other efforts that you guys are doing to try to get people involved again?
We, over our entire history, are known for our issues forums at the local level. And for example, over the last couple of years, our major issues have been healthcare reform and global climate change. And we at the National League level have given what we call pass-through grants to some of our local leagues. Unfortunately, the grants aren't large enough that we can give it to each and every one of our local leagues, but we have passed through money to help them put on public forums, educational forums, at which they invite speakers on both sides of the issue. That's one of the requirements that we have, that all sides be represented so that people can make their own decisions coming out of that. And the educational forums are one of the best ways that we have of reaching out to people. Now, that being said, you know what happens at those educational forums? We're usually preaching to the choir. And so we are making some concerted efforts to go into communities that perhaps don't have the history of involvement on healthcare reform or global climate change. And so I encourage everyone to try to partner with your local league to bring those forums into communities, into places that don't often have forums where they're talking about global climate change. You can use the schools as a great method for that. You can bring it to the younger students, but you know what happens when you bring it to the younger students? They drag mom and dad along, and we end up educating the people that can vote. But you know, we're all about educating future voters too.
I have a question right over here. If you'll please wait for the mic.
Hi, my name's Kate, and I'm a resident here in Little Rock. And I've been involved in some highly debated issues here locally concerning our local water reservoir. And I've taken notes here to share with my daughter and her friend tonight. But I couldn't pass up the opportunity to make a comment. He asked, what do you do to engage the community locally and educate the community locally? And I can't help but take this opportunity to say that on this very controversial issue here locally for the last 4 or 5 years, we've had a very dedicated group from the league here locally who have done exactly what you said. They study the issue. They look at all sides. They try to find the common ground, the win-win, and then they offer that education to the public, and they've been very effective, and I really appreciate them, and they know who they are.
Thank you, and thank you to the local league.
We have a question, Graylin. Oh, Hallie had one, I thought, okay.
Ms. Wilson, thank you again for coming, and I'm really impressed by your international work, and I know you mentioned during lunch that the league might be interested in doing work in South America, and I was wondering if you could just expound on that.
Certainly. We do act globally, and that's kind of historical also. We were one of the first supporters of the League of Nations back in 1920. And of course, we followed through with the United Nations after World War II. So we come to our international work rather naturally. We have really 2 prongs to that work. One is that we, through grants primarily from the State Department, although occasionally from individual citizens, we do 2 things. We can help with elections in different countries. We can help groups understand how to educate voters leading up to elections. We also actually go out and do some monitoring of elections. But in recent years, and I think probably more effectively and more importantly, we play a role, just as we do in this country, in teaching local groups in different countries, and we've worked a lot in African countries. We've worked some in Central American countries, and we're now working in Brazil and Colombia to bring these same kinds of citizen participation ideas to those countries. Because we in this country, we're used to having so many of our NGOs, the organizations that are charged with keeping the government on their toes, that we don't often realize that in a lot of countries, that really hasn't been an organized effort. You may have 1 or 2 people that work. But what we try to do is bring a group of citizens from that foreign country to the United States. We have them look at, they come, they live with local league members, stay with local league members. The local leagues will take them to different organizations and talk about how you go about getting a grassroots campaign organized and participating. They will see how we go about doing it in this country. And then they will take those tools back to their country and very often start organizations. And you know, the training that we do when we go to have that reciprocal visit in the other country, the training that we do is also about, well, choose a project that's important to your particular community, and let's walk through and model the way in which you might have an impact. And one of the big issues that we very often find is the people in the community don't have clean water. And they want clean water for their children to drink and to bathe in. And so we use a training session that's built around, okay, how in this particular community, in this country, can you go about changing the government's way of thinking to achieve clean water? So we try to teach them the practical aspect of rabble-rousing. Yeah.
We've got time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
I have a two-part question, not to try to get away with something. First, and this should be fairly short, you mentioned Lindsey Graham as a co-sponsor. I have recently heard and read that he has flatly said that cap and trade is dead. So I'm curious as to how he is a co-sponsor of legislation that, if I understood you right, would promote cap and trade.
It's an alternative piece of legislation to the cap and trade legislation. It is a way to achieve the cap part of it without necessarily including the full trade part.
Well, that's interesting because a couple of years ago, there was a speaker here at the Clinton School, Dr. Robert Shapiro, who was involved with the Clinton administration as a climate change overseer. Is that a good word? And he talked extensively, as I said, he's a macroeconomist. He talked extensively about cap and trade versus simple tax on carbon emissions. And he very strongly supports the latter as opposed to the former because of market manipulation that could occur with the former over time. So I'd like your response to that.
It's interesting you should bring that up because within our own local and state leagues, we have supported the cap and trade legislation. Within our own local and state leagues, they have been asking that we take another look at the carbon tax approach. The problem, of course, with the carbon tax approach is who's going to pay that tax? We all know who's going to pay the tax, and it's us that use the electricity. And so that's the hard thing to get around with respect to the carbon tax. But it is a potential compromise way that we can hopefully move towards some kind of a cap on emissions. And we have to explore all of those possibilities.